So before we begin, I have an announcement to make. I just want to acknowledge and to thank Reverend Lori for 45 wonderful years of marriage. This is our 45th anniversary. I don't know where the time went. It just seems like we blinked our eyes and it's gone. But certainly this life would not be one worth living without her, and we would not have come as far as we have come if it weren't for all of her love and her support and her wisdom and her enthusiasm. So I thank her for being in my life and in your life as well. So we want to come together today. What we want to talk about is moving from fear to fearlessness, from fear to fearlessness. And we want to kind of think of things in a continuum. Remember those little continuum lines that we drew in math, the number line? And 0 was in the middle, and everything to the left was negative, and everything to the right was positive. And in philosophy, they kind of use those to describe virtue. Virtue is right at the center of the line, and anything too far to the extreme, one way or the other, is to be considered a vice. So, for example, when it comes to money, if you are a miser, you might be all the way over on the left, and to be a miser is not a good thing. And if you're a spendthrift, you're all the way over on the right. But if you're right in the center, if you're virtuous when it comes to money, you don't waste money, you don't hoard money, you use money wisely. That kind of a thing. So we want to kind of think of this continuum, perhaps, of from fear to fearlessness, and all the way over on the one side might be what we would consider somebody who's paralyzed by fear, somebody who is so afraid that that they don't do anything, they can't do anything, they're just afraid. Um, you hear of people who are so afraid they can't go out of their house. They're afraid. They're just completely incapacitated by their fear. And then all the way over on the right, in the human experience, all the way over on the right, you might have somebody who's bravado, who claims that they have no fear, even though they probably do, and they just will go and do things that are absolutely absolutely dangerous and reckless, if you will, and get themselves or get other people in all kinds of trouble. And somewhere in between is the fearlessness that I'm talking about. Not a false fearlessness, not a I will go do anything just to show the world I'm not afraid kind of fearlessness, but a true calm, a true peace. And what we want to remember is that the continuum that I just described for you is functioning at a human level, at the level of human experience. But we are spiritual beings. We are spiritual beings. And at the spiritual essence, the spiritual level, God has never been afraid. God never could be afraid. God never would be afraid, for God is all there is. Really get that. God is all there is. How can God be afraid of itself? You see the image that they put on America's Funniest Home Videos sometimes of little children who discover their shadow, and they're terrified of their own shadow. God cannot be afraid of itself. God cannot be afraid of itself. So God is fearless. In fact, the divine would not even understand a word for fear. It was like trying to talk to the sun about darkness. Just there's no comprehension. There can be no way for the light to comprehend darkness. So that which we call the divine, that which we call God, is the fearlessness that I'm talking about when I talk about moving from fear to fearlessness. We want to move from the fear, which is the human experience, to the fearlessness, which is the divine nature. Now, Dr. Holmes talks about this in several chapters of Living the Science of Mind. If you're dealing with any fear in your life, you might want to find a copy of that book. There's several essays that he has in there towards the end where he deals straightforward with fear. And he tells us, first of all, that fear is like a contagion. Fear is contagious. You get on the bus Or you get on the subway in the morning, or you go to work in the morning and you're feeling pretty good, and all of a sudden you move into this atmosphere where somebody is so terribly afraid. They may not even say it, but just their mannerism, just the way that they sit and just the way that they act, they're tense, and that fear is contagious. And if we don't watch it, if we're not careful to guard our own reaction, right, that we can pick up on that emotion of fear. We can capture it. We can catch it like we would catch a cold. So think of the human consciousness as a sea. It might be the best way to describe it. It's a sea, and each and every one of us is floating around. Our individual consciousness is floating around, but we are part of this bigger sea. And what is true of the seawater everywhere, we are exposed to it. So the race consciousness, as Dr. Holmes would call it, the collective consciousness, as Carl Jung would call it, right? The collective memory of all of humankind is filled with fear. It is filled with fear. It is there. It is palpable. And if we do not take deliberate action to insulate, isolate, and inoculate ourselves from this fear, we get swept up in it without even giving it our consent, right? That's the definition of emotion. If you look in the dictionary, an emotion is an attitude or a state of mind that we did not come to through the intellect. We came to it through intuition, or we just came to it in a manner that we don't even know how to describe. But somehow there is this attitude, this state of consciousness that has taken a hold of us, and it produces physical changes in our bodies. Right? It produces tension. It produces chemicals that we may have learned, for the flight or fight response. That the adrenaline starts pumping and the chemicals start going and the heart starts racing, and we get all set to do something, whether it be to fight or to run. We're going to do something, and that's what fear is preparing us to do. And of course, there was a time in the evolution of the human being that was appropriate. But now there's a time where it's not appropriate, because if we live in a constant state of fear, and our bodies are constantly being exposed to these chemicals to get ready for fight or flight, now we're being told that they have an adverse effect on our health, right? That they wear us down, that they cause disease. So human fear is like a contagion, and Dr. Holmes tells us that wouldn't it be great if one day we opened the newspaper and we read that there had been an outbreak of fear, and this outbreak of fear was sweeping over the nation, but there had been an antidote. There had been an antidote of love. There had been an antidote of poise. There had been an antidote of confidence, and that is now counteracting the fear, and the fear is dissolving. Dr. Holmes tells us that you and I are that antidote. You and I are that individual who deliberately refuses to be swept up in the fear, who chooses to maintain an attitude of consciousness, an attitude of peace, an attitude of love, an attitude of confidence. And we're mindful of what is going on within us, around us, and through us. We become mindful of when this fear is starting to have an impact on us, and we stop right then and we break the cycle of fear. So I want you to think how prevalent this is in our society, why this is so important, that we need to be aware of it, and we need to move from fear, from human fear, to fearlessness, that is divine confidence. And if you look around, you want to remember that the emotion of fear is not a conscious choice. It's not a conscious reaction. It's not something we sit down and we weigh and we analyze, and we draw charts and graphs, and we look at numbers and we say, oh my God, now we need to be afraid. Fear is something that just wells up. Fear is an emotion that comes not by a logical process. It is there. And in fact, it is a pre-programmed response. As Dr. Holmes tells us, that anytime you see somebody acting out of fear, you can be certain that they learned how to act that way. That all they are doing is they are responding in the manner that they have learned to be appropriate. He tells us that infants are born with only two fears, the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. Every other fear is learned. So when we see ourselves or we see another getting caught up in fear, what we want to remember is that is a learned response. And what we have learned, we can unlearn. And once we unlearn it, we can teach ourselves a different way to respond, a different way to react. There's hope there. We're not hopelessly stuck in fear. We are simply reacting the way that the human race has deemed appropriate over the thousands and thousands of years. And now we can stop and we can say, there's a better way. There's another way. There's a different way. But because fear is something that wells up without our conscious awareness, fear is something that people who want to manipulate us use, and they use it very subtly. Very subtly they use this emotion of fear. In other words, if they can get us to be afraid of something, if they can arouse that fear within us, what happens is our logic and our reason stop working. And whatever they are telling us is more likely to be accepted. We're more likely to accept it than if we were thinking reasonably and rationally. So this idea of confusing people, of getting people confused, of getting them afraid, of getting their emotions aroused in order to manipulate them, is nothing new. It's nothing new. Aristotle gave us the rhetoric triangle thousands of years ago because the sophists were running around agitating people and getting their way. They were winning. They were winning debates. They were winning legal arguments. They were winning not on the virtue of logic and reason, but on the virtue of sophistry, on the virtue of manipulation. And that exists today. That exists today. If you turn on the evening news, we were talking before the service started about the floods in Texas. If you turn on the evening news this week, the lead story every night this week has been about floods, about tornadoes, bold pictures of lightning coming down and striking, and all of these things that we are naturally afraid of. I mean, none of us wants to deal with a flood. None of us wants to be swept away in a flood or lose our loved ones in a flood. None of us wants to be hit by lightning. So the lead stories in the news are stories that are going to frighten us. They are stories that are going to get us emotionally involved before we even know what's going on. As soon as that TV comes on, as soon as the music goes off, as soon as they jump into the story, it is something that is going to arouse our emotion. It's something that is going to hook us. And we stay tuned. We stay tuned to that. And the natural questions we ask are, well, how can I protect myself from that? How can I make sure that doesn't happen to me? And they have all of these stock reports that they go back to showing you what to do if your car gets submerged when you're in it, how to escape. And it doesn't matter what happens. It seems like they have stock footage for it. The airliner lands in the Hudson River. That's happened once in the entire history of aviation. How many billions of flights there must have been so far? That's happened once. And yet they have special reports on how you can escape if you happen to be caught up in that situation. What they're doing is they're playing off of our fear. What they're doing is they are getting us afraid, and then they are kind of showing us something that is going to help alleviate the fear. Politicians do this. Politicians are always telling us what we need to be afraid of, and if we elect them as our representative, why, they will do something to take care of those fears. Jon Stewart has some funny clips where he's taken certain politicians who kind of excel at that method of leading, and it just shows the politician one speech after another, and the topic may be different. It might be people coming across the border. illegally. It might be Ebola. It might be same-sex marriage. It might be ISIS. You name it. It's just one after the other. But it's the same speech. It is the same speech. And this person goes on about what a great threat our country is in because of this fill-in-the-blank issue. And all they're doing is trying to push the fear button. They need for us to be afraid, because if they can get us to be afraid, then we say, well, how can I protect myself against that? And they say, well, do what it is that I tell you to do, and then you'll be okay. Vote for me, send me money, all of those things. And it goes on to our religions. And Dr. Holmes says it's terrible and it's unfortunate, but it goes on to our religions. Our religions have told us that there's a place where we will go and we will burn for eternity and we will suffer. Unless, of course, we become adherents of that religion and do the things that religion tells us to do, and put money in the basket when the basket comes around, and those sorts of things. And what this means is there are those people around us who, for their own self-serving interests, want to keep us afraid. They want to find the fear button. They want to push the fear button. They want us to be afraid. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't things around that we need to, as Dr. Holmes puts it, demonstrate caution, to use caution about. But we don't have to be afraid. See, we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to have, as the dictionary says, an unpleasant emotion of dread, of some harm, of something bad is going to happen. We don't have to release into our bodies all of the fight or flight chemicals that go with being afraid. We can be cautious without being afraid. Here's an example. You get up in the morning, you're getting ready to go to work, and you turn on the morning news, and they come on with the morning drive report, and they tell you, it's very foggy out this morning. It's very foggy. You need to use caution. You need to give yourself more time. You need to be careful as you're going to work. Now, are you afraid? Do you not go to work because it's foggy? Do you get in the car with a sense of dread that something is going to come out of the fog and hit your car? Or do you use caution? Do you turn on your parking lights, and you give yourself extra room, you drive a little bit slower, you do all the things that you're trained to do and how to drive in the fog so that you get to work. You leave a little bit earlier, those kind of things. So you use caution, but you don't have to be afraid. You're not afraid. And that's the difference that we're talking about. If you're walking along the edge of a high cliff, you use caution. You don't have to be so afraid that you incapacitate yourself with fear, but you use caution. Right? You use sense. You stay back far enough that you don't fall off the edge of the cliff. So what has happened is we have grown up in a society where we are constantly surrounded by and bombarded by fear, deliberately, consciously. People trying to make us afraid, and unconsciously kind of soaking in the sea in the contagion of fear. It is around us. It is all about us. It is impossible for us not to be exposed to it. And there was a time when the fear served us well. Thomas Strower talks about the evolution to the fifth kingdom. And here's what he's talking about is that, we had the minerals, and the minerals kind of got together, and somehow we had the vegetables, the plant life came, and life kind of evolved from the mineral to the vegetable. And as it did, it moved into a form of expression that had a little bit more intelligence and a little bit more mobility than the minerals did. And then the plant life evolved, and the plant life evolved into the animal life. And again, we saw a shift in mobility and a shift in intelligence. And the animal life then evolved into the human life, into a being that is self-aware. And we are capable of becoming aware of what we are thinking and feeling and analyzing it and changing it deliberately. It's something that, to our knowledge, no other species can do. So evolution brought us to this state of self-awareness. Again, more mobility and more intelligence. But while we were evolving, the idea of fear, of being afraid, helped the species survive. To be afraid, to be on heightened alert, if you have your senses on heightened alert, to have the chemicals pumping through your body so you're ready to flee or to fight, that was good as far as evolution was concerned, especially when we were going through an environment that was full of dangers and wild animals and all kinds of things that would threaten the human life. And in the societies, in the early societies, the person who could predict what it was that we needed to be afraid of, to predict where the danger was coming from, that was a very valuable person in early societies. The king or the chief or whoever was in charge of the society would take a person like that and make them an advisor. So when food was scarce, this person still got to eat. when when water was scarce, this person got to drink. It became a valuable asset to be able to predict danger. And some of that exists today. You see that in some of the emails that you get where people telling you, "Oh, don't do this because terrible things are going to happen." Right? That's that instinct that has been instilled in us that says warn other people of danger. It doesn't matter whether the danger was a real danger or not, as long as it doesn't come to pass, as long as the people don't get destroyed by it, the predictor is okay. Nobody goes back and remembers how many times somebody told you to worry about something that never happened. So this idea that while life was bringing itself to the point where we now are, which Troward calls entering the fifth kingdom, becoming spiritually aware, becoming aware that we are more than human beings, that a certain amount of fear was good, a certain amount of fear was necessary, a certain amount of fear was unavoidable. But now we have entered the fifth kingdom. We have entered the realm where we recognize ourselves to be spiritual beings. Right? We recognize the soul being the individualized expression of the divine as us. So now we start to enter into the fifth kingdom, the spiritual kingdom, and fear no longer serves us. Fear holds us back. Fear keeps us from being the best that we can be. Right? Because if you're trying to move forward and you're afraid, you're always looking over your shoulder. You're always second guessing yourself. You're always holding something back in reserve in case something goes wrong. In case my worst fears, like Job said, my worst fears are upon us. So we never give all we have. We never be all we can be because we are moving forward timidly. We are moving forward in fear. So there comes a point in the evolution of our human consciousness when our human consciousness enters this self-aware as a spiritual being, a self-awareness, that we must recognize that fear is no longer appropriate. Caution may be appropriate, but fear is no longer appropriate. And we want to let go of it because it is holding us back. We want to let go of it because, in fact, it is ungodly. And really, if you think of our spiritual evolution, what we are constantly doing is releasing and letting go of everything in our consciousness that is not in harmony with the divine consciousness. That's all we're doing. Right? The divine consciousness is already here. Omnipresence is already here. The divine poise is already here. The divine confidence is already here. So what we are doing as we are growing and as we are evolving spiritually is we are letting go of those things that don't match up with what God is. That's all we're doing. That's all we are really doing. And we come to a point in our life where we recognize that fear is not a characteristic of God. And we want to let it go. So Dr. Holmes gives us a couple of ideas as he goes through these several chapters that he has about fear in Living the Science of Mind. And there's one quote in there, and I hope I get it right. I don't have the book open to the page in front of me. But he says it doesn't matter if the technique of letting go of the fear is a psychological technique or a psychiatry or or religious technique. It doesn't matter. He says what all of the techniques ultimately amount to is giving the self back to the self and then re-educating the self to align it with the power and the poise and the goodness that already exists. Giving the self back to the self and then re-educating the self to align it with the goodness and the peace and the poise that is already here. And I thought, wow, how simple is that? You know, if you think about 12-step programs and people are going through recovery, and one of the first thing they have to do is admit that they have a problem. They have to give the self back to the self. See, and when we're living in fear, sometimes we deny that we're living in fear. We deny that fear is all about us. We deny that fear is a contagion. We're not even aware that we're in fear. So Dr. Holmes tells us one of the first things that we should do is to acknowledge our fear, to acknowledge the experience of fear. Now I want to be clear here, you don't want to acknowledge the necessity of fear. You want to acknowledge that it exists and it has an impact on your life. Now Holmes tells us to go and sit down with somebody we trust and to openly admit to them, I'm afraid. I have these fears. Because opening that door opens the door for the healing, opens the door for giving the self back to the self. So now I am no longer an individual who's pretending I am not afraid, who's whistling in the dark to prove that I'm not afraid, but rather I am a human being and I say, part of the human experience is fear, and I do have fear. Now you may not have anybody that you can go and sit and talk to, or somebody that you would want to go and sit and talk to. So just get a journal book, get a little notebook, and start to write to yourself. Talk to yourself. And say, I'm worried. I'm fearful. I see all this stuff on the news and I'm concerned. Whatever it may be, start to release it, if you will. Start to open that door. But we don't just want to acknowledge it by looking at it and saying it's there. We want to transcend it, as I talked about last week. We want to move beyond it. We want to let go of it. We want to move beyond fear and into fearlessness. And what Dr. Holmes tells us then is what we need to do is start to recognize that we are part of the divine, that the power that put us here, the power that created us out of itself and it put us here, is still here. It is still now. It is still omnipresence, the same yesterday, today, and forever. It has not left us. Frederick Bales puts it another way and says the intelligence that took 2 tiny cells in our mother's womb and turned them into the beautiful little bodies that we were born in did not abandon us the day we were born. It is still with us. It is still here. It is still now. So what we want to recognize then is that God is fearlessness. Doesn't even know the word fear. Couldn't even understand why there would be a word for fear. That God is omniscience, total wisdom, omnipotence, total power. And Emmett Fox tells us that those 2 characteristics combine into what we call poise. Poise. Perfectly calm, perfectly still, perfectly at peace. Nothing could be against it because it is all that there is. all that there is. In our human experience, we talk about courage. And courage is not the absence of fear, but courage is the ability to do what we need to do in spite of our fear. That is courage. But God is not courageous, for God does not have to act in spite of fear. God is poise. You get the difference? God has never been afraid. It doesn't have to be courageous. It is confidence. It is poise. It is ease. It knows what it wants to do, and it does it. It has the power to do so. It has the resources to do so. And when God says, let it be, the power that responds to its belief, the power of the law of mind, makes it so. And cannot argue, cannot complain, cannot say no. It simply does it. So what Dr. Holmes asks us to do is start first of all by recognizing that we are part of that divine. And then bringing ourselves to a sense of peace, of recognizing that it holds nothing against us. It does not want to punish us. It does not want to send us off to hell to burn forever and ever because we made mistakes. We have to consider that making mistakes is a required part of the experience. We were not born completely aware of everything. We were not born emotionally mature enough to deal with everything. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the number 4 in the Bible. We don't have it together on all 4 levels. We're learning. We're deciding. We do things. We get the feedback whether that worked well or it didn't work well, and we do other things. Maxwell Maltz, in his book Psycho-Cybernetics back in the 60s, he said if you look at the way that a guidance system works, think of an airplane on autopilot, running by GPS now. It knows where it is and it knows where it wants to go, and it's constantly checking for course corrections. Am I left? Am I right? That kind of logic. And if it's left, it brings itself right a little bit. If it's right, it brings itself left a little bit. If it crosses the center line, it makes a correction. And he says if you stop and look at the course from above, if you drew it on a map, it would be a series of zigzags. And eventually the zigzags would get so light that they would be almost impossible to perceive. But nevertheless, it's always adjusting. It's always making adjustments. And it does so without condemning or criticizing itself. It doesn't say, oh my God, why was I off course back there? Oh, how stupid am I? I'm going to have to pay for that. I'm going to have to be punished for that. No, it just simply makes a course adjustment. It just simply behaves differently. But what we tend to do in our human experience, and again, because we have been told, we have learned to think this way, we have learned to react this way without thinking, we have learned to be afraid without thinking, is that if we make a mistake, then we must be punished. And if we are to be punished, we are going to be punished for eternity. And the human race is suffering under this dread. It is suffering under this fear. And we have to get over that. We have to get beyond that. Dr. Holmes tells us, look at the parable of the prodigal son. When the son comes back home and he's beating himself up and telling the father how terrible a sinner he was, the father never acknowledges the sin. The father says, you were gone and now you're back. You've made your course correction. So we have to understand that as we go through this life, as we have been trying to figure out our way in this life, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? We didn't always behave in a manner that now we know we should have behaved in. But we have to recognize that that was a mistake. That was an error. And the consequences of that error were built into the error itself. The punishment, if you want to call it that, was built into the error itself. As I said in the opening treatment, if you put your hand down on a hot burner of a stove, the punishment is built right into that action. You burn your hand. It's not like God comes back and says, I need to punish you by burning your hand because you made a mistake. The consequences are built into the action. And if we think about what caused the action was our ignorance. What caused the action was not that we knew what we were doing. We were working kind of unconsciously. Maybe we weren't even paying attention and we put our hand on the stove. Maybe we thought the stove was turned off when we put our hand on the stove. But what we did out of ignorance. Had we known better intellectually, and had we been emotionally mature enough to do better, we would have done better. So what we want to understand is that when we change the consciousness that was behind our errors, when we change that consciousness, as soon as we change that consciousness, as soon as we change it, the need to experience the consequences goes away. That's what forgiveness is. Right? We have to learn to forgive ourselves. If you look in the New Testament, when Jesus healed people, occasionally he would say to them, your sins are forgiven. Your sins are forgiven you. Now, traditional theology says, well, this person was being punished by God because of their sins, and Jesus forgave their sins so they could be healed. And what we would say today is that the person was suffering the consequences of their erroneous thinking. And by telling them that their sins had been forgiven, Jesus was helping them to break that cycle of erroneous thinking. Stop thinking in the old way, and the consequences are no longer required. If you study any of the Eastern traditions, when you get into karma, sometimes people say, well, karma is inescapable. If you've done something, then you must suffer the consequences of it. They call that you can't outrun your karma. And that's not what I read at all. When I read the Dalai Lama's books and I read some of these traditions, it's when you change your consciousness. When you change your consciousness, you break that cycle. You no longer have to attract to yourself that which is the natural outpicturing of your thinking. I'll give you an example. If you believe in lack and limitation, then stealing seems reasonable. Now, because you believe in lack and limitation, you suffer the consequences. Right? You get to live a life of lack and limitation. That's why you committed the act of theft. And of course, life is a game of boomerangs. What goes around comes around, So if you believe in lack and limitation, you will outpicture lack and limitation. Perhaps not in money. You might be able to steal money and seem to get away with it. But in some other area of your life, you will experience the consequences of thinking in terms of lack and limitation. You could say that's karma. It is. It is the natural outpicturing of the consciousness. But as soon as the individual changes their consciousness, as soon as they move from ideas of lack and limitation into abundance and prosperity and unity, then they no longer need to experience the outpicturing of lack and limitation in any way, shape, or form in their lives. So what Dr. Holmes tells us we want to do is, first of all, if we are subject to any fears, we want to acknowledge that. But then we want to acknowledge that those fears do not exist within the mind of God. That God is all there is and God is here now. And those fears do not exist within the mind of God. They exist in human consciousness, which can be transcended. And we can trust in God, that God is not trying to punish us. God is not going to send us to hell, but God accepts us. The minute that we change our consciousness, the minute that we come back home, the divine says, you were gone, but now you're back. Welcome. And we can go forward anew. We can start a new life and we can go forward anew without having to carry around the guilt, the idea that we ought to be punished, the inferiority complexes, and all the other things that he goes into in this book. But we can go forward anew as spiritual beings. So we want to recognize what the divine is. The divine is fearless in that the divine has no need to be afraid, never had a need to be afraid, never could be afraid, and doesn't even understand what fear is. That the divine is just perfect love. It is perfect peace. It is perfect poise. It is always capable. It is always competent. And now that we can move beyond this point of allowing fear to impact our lives, what we can do is begin to express our lives more fully, more completely. We can begin to align ourselves with the unconditional love that is God. How can I express unconditional love today? We can begin to align ourselves with the unlimited beauty that God is. How can I allow more beauty to come into this human experience through me today, as me today? You know, kindness, loving kindness, right? How can God be loving kindness as me today? How can I be the person on the bus that instead of emitting fear and allowing people to get caught up in my fear, how can I be that person who emits love and allows people to get caught up in my love? How can I be that person that wherever I go, that the ideas and race consciousness of fear that are trying to come in just bounce away? Because love and hate can't exist in the same place at the same time. Light and dark can't exist in the same place at the same time. Emma Curtis Hopkins tells us there is no mixture of evil in my idea of good. And there is no mixture of fear in my idea of poise. God is perfect poise, total wisdom and total power, poise. It is capable, it is confident, and it only knows that it can. It could never even think that it could not. So what we want to do is we want to move ourselves then from this human condition of fear, which may at one time have been appropriate, but is no longer appropriate for us, and we want to let go of fear. We want to move into fearlessness. The most we want to do is to exercise human caution when appropriate, but not fear. Not fear. We want to align ourselves, right? We want to give ourself back to ourself. We want to recognize that we have been functioning out of fear at an unconscious level. Now we are consciously aware of it, and we re-educate ourselves by aligning with God. And we want to come into the love and into the peace and into the poise and into the fullness of God. We want to take our lamp from under the bushel and let it shine. We want to go forward in complete confidence that the Lord shepherds me and I lack nothing. That I dwell in the secret place of the Most High. I keep my mind on God. And Dr. Holmes tells us that one of the best ways to do this, and I love his analogy, he says, is spiritual sunbathing. Spiritual sunbathing. You know, we all like to go out from time to time and just sit in a chair and push it back and let the sunlight bask on our eyes and feel the warmth on our body and to just absorb it. To just absorb it. To just completely surrender to the feeling of the warmth and the peace and the love. And when we meditate, when we be still and know, when we go within and we just allow the love of God to bathe us like the sun, we are spiritually sunbathing. We are allowing the omnipotence to dissolve anything unlike itself. We're allowing the omniscience to wash away anything unlike itself. We are taking the time to allow the unconscious reactions that we have to human race consciousness, the unconscious reactions of fear, to be washed away into the nothingness from which they came. See, God did not create us to be afraid. God did not create us to fear it. God created us to express its life as us. We are an individualized expression of it. When it created that which we call our soul, what did it have to create from? From itself. We are a spark of the divine. The poet says we are a spark that may be desecrated but never destroyed, right? We heap ignorance upon ourselves, but the omniscience is still there, waiting to be revealed. So we want to recognize then that the divine has been waiting patiently in quiet repose for you and I to awaken to this fifth kingdom, to this spiritual nature within, and to say yes to all that God is, and to say no to all that God is not. So we take this whole experience of human fear and we recognize that it was okay while it was serving its purpose through evolution, but we're done with it now. We're done with it now. So in Buddhism it says when you take your raft across the river, you don't pick your raft up on your back and carry it with you. You're done with it. You leave the raft behind. You leave your fear behind. It got you this far. That's what its purpose was. Right? But remember, fear is not concerned with your greatest self-expression. Fear is concerned with keeping you alive. Now you recognize that you already are alive, but that life came from God, not from fear. And that life cannot be destroyed, so there's no need to be afraid. There's no need to be afraid. But there is a need to be expressed. So I invite you this week as you go forward, imagine what would it be like if I were not afraid? What would it be like if the world were not afraid? What would the news be like on TV if people weren't trying to push a fear button to keep us from changing the channel? What would it be like if everybody was expressing himself or herself to the best of their ability? What would it be like if we were encouraging one another to find the presence of God within and to give it more latitude to express itself in this human plane of existence through us and as us? What would it be like? It's possible. We just have to let go of that which we have allowed to hold us back, because we no longer need fear, and we embrace fearlessness. And so it is.